Today we're dealing with the last two antitheses in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And you remember an antithesis is when Jesus says, "You have heard it said," and he's memorializing and reminding us of the Mosaic law or God's instruction for his people. And then he says, "But I tell you," which means he's rounding out that Mosaic law. He's giving it a little bit more depth, and he's giving it a different nature. In today's first one, he says, "You have heard it said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you," and then he gives us 5 examples of how we should not go after an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. In the world of Jesus' day, the actual idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was designed to limit retaliation when somebody was hurt or offended. Because what would happen is if you accidentally poked out my eye, I might come and decide to cut off your head. And so the whole idea of this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth wasn't to prescribe retaliation, but to limit retaliation so that people wouldn't act out in anger and overreact. In fact, in the ancient world, there were certain cities that were called sanctuary cities, where if you did something accidentally on purpose to another person, you could run to that city and have safe harbor until you could have a fair trial. So Jesus says, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you this." He's teaching us non-violent ways of standing up for ourselves and demanding dignity. And the first one has to do with if somebody slaps you on the left cheek, that you should turn to them your right cheek, you should turn to them your left cheek. And what's behind this is in the world of Jesus' day, if somebody who felt they were superior to you wanted to insult you, they could backhand you perfectly legally. And in so doing, they would demean you and humiliate you. A lot of times this would happen to children of parents or wives who were considered property, slaves, or anybody considered to be less than that person slapping you. It was a way of dehumanizing somebody, making them less than human, and insulting them. But when Jesus says to turn to them your other cheek, what he's saying is stand up for your rights, demand to be fully human, but make them slap you with an open hand on the other cheek, because to do so in the Roman world was a crime. So now they have to stand up and face you as fully human, as fully equal, and being willing to deal with the consequences. The second example Jesus gives is that of if you're being sued and they're trying to take your clothes, give them also your coat. In other words, you would be standing naked in front of the court in order to get people to recognize the way they were treating you. Of course, Jesus was speaking in hyperbole. No one would stand naked in court, and in Judaism, to be found naked in public was a huge embarrassment and a sin. But Jesus uses this hyperbole to talk about how important it is to be treated as fully human and with dignity. Because if someone was to take your outer garment, if you were poor, that might be your blanket at night, and the only way you could stay warm and not freeze to death and possibly get sick or die by not having that coat. And there was a standard practice in ancient Israel where if you borrowed or needed something and you were going to come back later in the day to pay for it, they would hold your outer garment as collateral for that payment. And it was a crime to keep that garment overnight. So Jesus once again is telling people, stand up for your humanity. Don't treat people less than human. Demand dignity in all of your interactions with other people. The third one had to do with the Roman soldiers. Their battle packs were immensely heavy. It's estimated they weighed between 75 and 100 pounds. And when they would be moving around from city to city or post to post, they would have to carry this battle pack. And they were allowed by Roman law to commandeer anybody they came upon and say, "Hey, carry my pack for the next mile." And so you'd be required by law to pick up that heavy pack and trudge that mile. In so doing, they exercised their authority over you. They made you less than human. They didn't treat you with the dignity that you deserved. So Jesus says if they're going to make you go one, then go two, because that's now a decision that you've made, that you're demanding them to treat you as an equal, fully human, and with dignity. And by the way, if you were a soldier and you got caught forcing somebody to carry your load a second mile, you could be court-martialed. You could be in a lot of trouble. So in so doing, in these first three, Jesus is teaching us how to, in a nonviolent way, stand up for our humanity, for our dignity. The next two he mentions have to do with beggars and people who borrow. And at first, when you think about this retaliation idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, how do these people come into play? And I'm not sure, but I think it's something like this. Sometimes when people beg, we go to great extremes to not make eye contact, to try to get the car to move to the other lane, or whatever we have to do to avoid this person because they make us feel uncomfortable. And I know when I used to go with Linda to her treatments in Indianapolis, there was one corner that we always had to go past, and there was always the same person there asking for money. And the first few times we gave him a few dollars, and then one day he wasn't there, and I began to wonder what happened to him. And about a month later, as we turned the corner, I saw him coming out of a house, getting ready to walk to his corner. And I instantly became angry. It was like, how could he do this? How could he cheat me like this? But Jesus has told us that if people beg, we don't need to know what the reasons are. We don't need to know if it's legitimate. We need to treat them with dignity and let God sort out whether they're being just or not. And have you ever had a family member, a neighbor, a relative that borrows something and either brings it back broken, or somebody comes in, hey, I want to borrow a cup of sugar. I'll bring it back tomorrow after I go to the grocery store. And you never see that cup of sugar. And then 2 days later, they're back for a couple eggs. Oh, we're not. And this aggravates us, and we want to retaliate. We want to be angry. We want to treat them as less than human because of the way they've treated us, rather than with humanity and dignity. Now, those are really trite ideas or examples, I know, but here's how this plays out on a grander scale. This whole idea of dehumanizing people and treating them without dignity has led to a lot of atrocities, even in our own history. Take slavery, for instance. It was easy for our ancestors to take people captive from the dark continent because we called them savages. They were less than human. And we put them on these horrible slave ships and send them to this country and treat them horribly as property. And people of faith on both sides of this issue use the same Bible to support their point of view when it came to slavery. And even after abolition, and black people, black men of color, black men or men of color were not allowed to vote or to own property because they were still only considered 2/3 human. By not treating them as fully human, it okayed slavery. When we look a little farther down the road in our expansion west of the Mississippi, when immigrants came to this country, they saw themselves as the new chosen people of God. And everything west of the Mississippi was their promised land. And it was okay, just like Joshua, to do anything they had to do to possess that land. And because they saw the indigenous peoples as less than human, as savages who didn't worship or live the way they lived, they thought it was okay to massacre them, to move them, and to put them on reservations. And then when we tried to go and make things better, rather than reinstituting them in their lands with their customs and their beliefs, we forced them to cut their hair, to wear Western style or Eastern style clothing. We forced them to speak English and not their native tongues, and forced them to abandon their native religious beliefs. And again, people of faith on both sides of the issue use the same Bible to support their point of view. If we move forward to the 1920s and women's suffrage, women weren't given the right to vote because they were property. They couldn't own property. If they couldn't own property, they couldn't vote. They were less than. They were to be subservient. And people of faith on both sides of this issue use the same Bible to support their point of view. But because we saw women as less than human and didn't treat them with dignity, we tried to keep them from having the right to vote. Then we have the civil rights movement, the same issues. And even today, women who do the same job as men make considerably less than men, and women of color make even less. And so whenever we treat people as less than human and we don't treat them with the dignity they deserve, we lead ourselves down this path of being difficult to get along with, of not seeing people as equals, of not treating them fairly, and not building the kingdom that God has put us here on earth to build, where all people are treated as fully human, as imago Dei, with dignity and provided for. So the next antithesis, Jesus says, you have heard it said to love your neighbor but hate your enemy. But I tell you to love your enemies and those who persecute you. Now this is really hard. And some of those enemies were the people that we just talked about in our past. Sometimes it's the people we dehumanize, the people we don't treat with respect and dignity as fully human, the ones that become our enemies, the other. And in ancient Judaism, it was said that you should love your neighbor, and your neighbor was anybody like you. But your enemy was anybody who was not like you. And there is so much of that kind of hate that goes on in our world today that it's almost unbelievable. The word here for love is agapeo. It's a love of the mind. It's an act of the will. In fact, what it means is that we intellectually and willfully decide that we are going to love somebody or something irregardless of how we feel about them, what we think of them. That we're going to treat them with humanity and dignity just like we want to be treated as fully human and with dignity. And at the end of this passage, Jesus says something amazing. He says, if you do this, you will be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a long way from perfect. I still do things that I'm ashamed of sometimes, and I'm sure you all do too. What Jesus and Matthew meant by perfect was more well-rounded. We'd be more like Jesus in the way we interact with one another. That's what the word perfect means. We have a long tradition in the Christian faith of what's called sanctification, where we're going on to perfection, that the longer we try to follow Christ, the longer we try to live the life of the kingdom, the less likely we are to sin, the less likely we are to mistreat those around us, to treat them less than human, and to treat them without dignity. Going on to perfection is something our founder John Wesley believed in. He actually for a while thought we would get to a point where we'd be so perfect in love that we wouldn't actually sin. And later in life, when he realized that that wasn't going to happen, he changed his thinking to be more of the being well-rounded, being so grounded in our faith tradition and following Christ's example that we would be less likely more and more to sin and to mistreat the people in our lives. And these are the two antitheses that have to do with treating people as fully human, as people in the image of God and with dignity, just like we would want to be treated as fully human, created in the image of God and with dignity. And that's one way that we can heal our divides and prevent divides from happening in the future.